Hallå allesammans! Oj, vad det här hördes bra. Och varmt välkomna till Timbro. Jag heter Karin Svanborg Sjövall och jag är VD här. Populismen är ju ett fenomen som ådrar sig allt mer uppmärksamhet. Och det vore egentligen konstigt om det var på något annat sätt. För det är nog en politisk jordbävning som vi bevittnar just nu. Och för att kunna förstå det vi ser och också förstå hur vi ska bemöta det, så är det viktigt att man både klarar av att zooma in och zooma ut på de här frågeställningarna. Vi behöver både ett makroperspektiv av det slag som Andreas Johansson Heinö snart kommer ge oss i Timbro Authoritarian Populism Index. Men vi måste också förstå enskildheterna. För jag tror att det här är en fråga som man måste klara av att diskutera parallellt på flera plan. Och den uppenbara frågan som vi är upptagna med, inte minst i Sverige, handlar ju förstås om hur det parlamentariska systemet ska hantera den här typen av konkurrens. Men det finns också en annan axel som handlar om hur vi som befinner oss utanför det parlamentariska spelet, men som fortfarande är engagerade i den politiska debatten, ska hantera den här typen av idégods. Inte minst därför att vi faktiskt ser inbrytningar även i våra egna led. Så den stora frågan någonstans är fortfarande ideologisk. Hur ska vi lära oss att bekämpa illiberala, auktoritära strömningar i ett läge när var femte väljare i Europa lägger sin röst på ett populistiskt parti? Så därför så är jag väldigt glad över att snart kunna be Andreas att komma upp och introducera det här indexet, men också att kunna välkomna våra utländska gäster. And here I will briefly switch to English in order to be able to introduce to you our guests. Diego Sanchez de la Cruz, who is the director of Civismo, the sister think tank of Timbro in Spain, as well as Matej Hajba, who is the director of the Free Market Foundation in Hungary. So the first part of the seminar will be held in Swedish for the first 25 minutes, and then we will have a discussion in English with our foreign guests. So that said, Andreas, please.
God middag. Igår vann Virginia Raggi borgmästarvalet i Rom. Hon representerar Beppe Grillos femstjärnerörelse, som också vann flera andra större städer i Italien igår. Och det där är ju den vanliga, uppenbara slutsatsen av nästan alla val som hålls i Europa just nu, att det går framåt för populisterna. För några veckor sedan så var Norbert Hofer några tusen röster, 0,3% från att bli president i Österrike. Vi har haft 3 delstatsval i Tyskland i vår. I alla valen så har AfD gått kraftigt framåt och är på väg att bli etablerade som Tysklands tredje största parti. Ett val i Slovakien tidigare i våras där ett nationalistiskt och ett högerextremt parti gick kraftigt framåt. Vi har haft framgångar för populister, radikala partier även i valen i Irland, Cypern, Serbien. Det är genomgående i varje enskilt val som har varit hittills i år, så var det även förra året. Vi befinner oss i en förändring i europeisk politik som jag tror är svår att överskatta. Och det är bakgrunden till det vi presenterar idag, som alltså heter Timbros Authoritarian Populism Index. Det är ett försök att ge en överblick, ett helhetsperspektiv på framgångar och inflytande för de partier som utmanar etablissemanget i europeisk politik. Då är det så att det här är ett uppdrag att kartlägga detta är både enkelt och svårt. Det är enkelt så tillvida att man egentligen bara behöver kunna räkna. Det bygger på valresultat. Det är också enkelt så tillvida att de allra flesta i praktiken är ganska överens om vilka partier som hör samman i den här kategoriseringen. Tittar man på hur forskningen ser ut så är det förbluffande lite oenighet om vilka partier som är innanför eller utanför de här kategoriseringarna. Det finns en ganska stor samsyn där. I den meningen så är det här inget originellt arbete. Det är en kartläggning som inte har gjorts på just det här sättet, och det har en ambitionsnivå vad gäller att vara heltäckande under en längre tidsperiod och så. Men det är inte särskilt kreativt vad gäller de enskilda partierna. Däremot är det också ett svårt arbete, för att till skillnad från sådana här etiketter som liberal eller grön eller socialdemokrat eller kristdemokrat så är det ju få partier som själva etiketterar sig som populister. Det är ännu färre som kallar sig själva att vi är auktoritära. Det är ju etiketter som sätts utifrån på några andra. Och det finns nästan alltid en nedvärderande, nedlåtande, negativ touch i de här benämningarna. Och det går inte att komma ifrån. Man blir en del av det etablissemang som de här partierna vänder sig mot när man också kartlägger och systematiserar. Det är en helt oundvikligt dilemma att hantera. Men då får man försöka göra det så bra som möjligt, så pass ödmjukt som möjligt. Och jag försöker då betona 3 aspekter som jag menar förenar den auktoritära populismen i europeisk politik, både till höger och till vänster. Det finns viktiga skillnader mellan höger och vänster. Det finns viktiga skillnader mellan partierna inom högern och inom vänstern. Men det vi betonar här är det som förenar de här som räknas med. Det totalt handlar om drygt 200 partier i 33 länder som ingår i studien. Och det första etiketten det kallar jag för då att man avvisar vad som i rapporten benämns som en europeisk konsensus. Vad åsyftas med det? Jo, det är tanken att europeisk politik sedan andra världskriget har utmärkts av en mycket bred politisk mittfåra. Där har samlats socialdemokrater, kristdemokrater, konservativa, liberaler, så småningom anslutit till det också gröna partier och senare även en del frihetlig vänster och postkommunistisk vänster, som har varit enade om spelreglerna för politiken i Europa. Ungefär hur de parlamentariska systemen ska fungera, hur maktdelningen ska se ut. Man har haft väldigt grundläggande respekt för vad som man brukar kalla i en bred term liberala demokratiska värderingar. Det har varit väldigt lite strid i europeisk inrikespolitik om spelreglerna för demokratin. Till den konsensus om spelreglerna har också lagts en hel del konsensus vad gäller väsentliga delar av politikens innehåll. Ett sådant tydligt exempel är ju Europeiska unionen. Så gott som varje etablerat parti i Europa är anhängare av EU. Medan den överväldigande majoriteten av de som vi kallar för auktoritära populister är negativa till EUs existens. De vill att deras land ska gå ut ur EU. De vill inte bara ha lite mer eller mindre makt till EU, utan de vill rasera hela konstruktionen. Man kan räkna upp en längre rad sådana sakfrågor där det också har funnits en samsyn i mittfältet i europeisk politik och som de här partierna vänder sig emot. Så det är en substantiell skillnad. Vad vill man med politiken? Man utmanar det som har funnits. Gemensamt för all populism är också idén att det finns ett folk och det finns en elit och de är i konflikt med varandra. Tanken av att folkviljan hämmas av en elit som är korrupt, en elit som mörklägger, en elit som konspirerar. Eliten är politisk, den är medial, den är akademisk, den är ekonomisk. Den finns där och den står i vägen för folkviljan. Det är ju, och så där kan det ju vara. System är mer eller mindre korrupta. Det finns naturligtvis fog ibland för att lyfta fram en stark elitkritik. Det kan man diskutera i enskilda sakfrågor, men överlag är detta den makroberättelse som de populistiska partierna berättar. Och också tanken att det finns den här folkviljan som man ska förverkliga. Och det leder över till den tredje punkten, och det är demokratisynen. De populistiska partierna är inte antidemokratiska. Men de har en mer reduktionistisk, en reducerande syn på demokrati, där demokrati likställs med majoritetsstyre. Man vill stärka demokratin ofta i den meningen. Både höger- och vänsterpopulisterna är varma anhängare av folkomröstningar. Det ska röstas och folket ska bestämma om allt möjligt. Men man är skeptiska till den demokrati som handlar om maktdelning, som handlar om att grundlagsfästa minoritetsrättigheter, att grundlagsfästa äganderätt, som handlar om de konstitutionella principer som den här konsensus i europeisk politik har värnat så länge. Så där finns det en substantiell skillnad i demokratisyn som är utmärkande. Det här är var vi försöker fånga när vi påstår att det finns en auktoritär populism som förenar många partier och att den då över tid har ökat i stöd. Som jag nämnde, indexets ambition är att ge en helhetsbild en överblicksbild av var befinner vi oss nu i ett perspektiv, under lite längre tidsperspektiv och ett helhetsperspektiv i Europa. Vi inkluderar 33 länder i studien. Det är samtliga EU-länder och det är de icke-EU-medlemmar som är fungerande demokratier. Och kriteriet är helt enkelt att man av Freedom House bedöms vara som ett fritt land. Det finns ingen poäng att ta med halvfria eller auktoritära länder i en sån här rankning. För där är problemet inte att det finns populistiska utmanare, utan det finns ett etablissemang som är auktoritärt. Så det är tvärtom. Så att ambitionen var heltäckande till hela det demokratiska Europa och då blir det 33 länder. Tidsperioden är 1980 fram till idag. 36 år drygt. Man kan vara ambitiös och gå ännu längre tillbaka. Det kanske man gör en uppföljare, men det blir inte så intressant för att det är, som jag kommer visa strax, så är det efter 1980 som stora förändringar sker. Så att det är tillräckligt perspektiv skulle jag säga för att förstå och få perspektiv på den nutida utvecklingen. Vi tittar då på alla parlamentsval. Inte lokala regionalval, inte europeiska val, utan nationella parlamentsval i länderna. Vi inkluderar alla partier som vid något tillfälle fått minst 0,1% av rösterna. Det är så nära heltäckande man kan vara för att ta med alla seriösa utmanare. Och då får man drygt 200 partier som uppfyller de kriterierna, varav hälften är så pass stora att de någon gång har vunnit mandat i ett parlament. Och vi tittar på väljarstöd, som sagt. Vi tittar också på inflytande i termer av mandat och i termer av medverkan i regeringsställning. Och det här är då den så att säga, Authoritarian Populism Index-kurvan som kommer ut av detta. Att vi befinner oss på en högsta nivå någonsin. Som Karin nämnde i introduktionen, nästan var femte europeisk väljare röstade i senaste valet på ett parti som uppfyller de kriterier jag nämnde nyss, som avvisar den här europeiska samsynen. Det är högre än någonsin. Det som är intressant att notera i ett historiskt perspektiv är att mellan 1980 och 2000 så ligger det ganska still. Det är en ökning från drygt 10 till knappt 12%. Det vill säga ungefär 9 av 10 väljare står bakom etablissemanget och var 10 står utanför. Men sen millennieskiftet så har stödet kraftigt ökat och närmar sig nu då nästan 20%. Vi visar en uppåtgående kurva som då är ökar stöd för auktoritära partier. Man skulle kunna göra den här listan tvärtom och visa en nedåtgående kurva som visar stödet för etablerade partier. Man kan beskriva detta som framgång för populismen, man kan också beskriva det som en tillbakagång för de etablerade partierna. Det är i alla fall en anmärkningsvärd förändring som äger rum. Delar man upp detta i höger och vänster så är det också intressant. Den auktoritära högern har ökat stadigt i 30 år. Går vi tillbaka till början på 80-talet så handlar det om 1 av 100 väljare som röstar på ett parti som befinner sig till höger om de etablerade högerpartierna i Europas länder. 1 av 100, det är ett marginellt fenomen. Och sen ökar det sakta men säkert systematiskt i 30 år. Vid några tillfällen så har man mitten på 90-talet till exempel kunnat tänka att nu kanske det har planat ut, sen har det vänt uppåt igen. Och man kan också se dem 2015-2016 har en stark uppåtkurva. Det här är en utveckling som inte ser ut att stanna av. Det finns ingenting i materialet här. Tittar man, vilket inte finns med i studien, men man gör det ändå, vilket man kan göra om man är intresserad. Och liksom aktuella opinionsundersökningar. Så skulle det vara val i stora länder idag i Europa så skulle det dra upp dramatiskt med flera procentenheter för att många av de här partierna ligger kraftigt över sina förra valresultat. Och det hänger såklart ihop med flyktingkrisen som en stor del. Till vänster så hade vi länge motsvarande utveckling. Den radikala vänstern tappade väljarstöd nästan varje år från 80-talets början och fram till så sent som 2006-2007. Då sjunker man från att ha haft nästan var 10:e europeisk väljare till att vara nere på knappt 3 av 100. Men sen som ni ser så är det en påtaglig ökning de senaste 5-6 åren. Det finns inget utrymme i den här rapporten för att diskutera orsakssamband. Man kan bara notera att det sammanfaller med efterdyningarna av finanskrisen. Och att det är liksom svårt att komma runt den hypotesen åtminstone. Tittar man landmässigt då, så den här figuren visar de färgglada staplarna visar 2016 just nu, alltså i senaste valet respektive land. Jämförelsepunkten är 2000. Det som är intressant här är ju dels att det ligger över i nästan varje land, det vill säga ökningen sker över hela Europa. Det är bara några enstaka länder som inte hänger med i den här ökningen. Och det andra är att det finns några outliers. Vi har 3 länder där det här är blivit ett etablissemangsfenomen. Ungern, Polen och Grekland så samlar den här typen av partier mellan 45 och 65% av rösterna. Och så finns det några i andra ändan som ligger på 0. Det är Island, Malta och Montenegro. Alltså de små länder. Det ska man också notera när det gäller siffrorna totalt sett, att de är förmodligen defensiva. För här jämför vi genomsnitt i olika länder, så att små länder räknas lika mycket som stora länder. Ska man titta på europeiska väljare så skulle de större länderna väga tyngre, och där är stödet högre i genomsnitt. Så att det är lågt räknat i den meningen. Några bara snabba landexempel. Jag har ju en bakgrund som jag inte gör någon hemlighet av, att jag har varit statsvetare. Och på den tiden så var det väldigt vanligt att jag hade kollegor som sa att det är så spännande fall Skandinavien. För då har vi de här Norge och Danmark som har sin populism. Och så har vi Sverige och Finland som inte har det. Vad kan det bero på? Och så kan man testa landförklaringar och förklara varför Sverige och Finland inte har haft den här utvecklingen. Det som har hänt efter de senaste 5, 6, 7 åren är ju att Sverige och Finland i princip har kommit i fatt och blivit genomsnittliga i ett europeiskt perspektiv, och att Skandinavien som helhet nu är någon slags frontrunner i Europa som driver den här utvecklingen framåt, där populistiska partier också har mer inflytande och mer framgångar. Det betyder kanske inte att de som letade förklaringar för några år sedan hade fel. Möjligen kan de teorierna förklara varför det dröjde längre i Sverige och Finland. Men den tiden är förbi när det finns de här typer av undantag. Sydeuropa är också intressant med en dramatisk utveckling de senaste åren. Det är framförallt till vänster som man ser den här utvecklingen. Med snabbt uppåtgående kurvor. Här visar vi Tyskland, Schweiz och Österrike som är intressant. Österrike använder sig som ett argument för att när de väl får makten så försvinner de. När FPÖ och Jörg Haider satt i regering så fick man ganska snabbt betala ett högt pris i efterföljande val. Men om man sedan har tålamod så ser man att det där stödet så småningom ökar till samma nivå igen. Nu är det senaste valresultat som gällde där. Tittar man på opinionsmätningar i Österrike så är ju FPÖ överlägset största parti just nu med 35% i opinionsmätningarna. Schweiz gradvis tillväxt, Tyskland på väg i fatt här också. En mycket viktig poäng, nu visar detta inte väljarstöd utan andel mandat i parlamenten. Över tid åtskillnaden totalitära populistiska partier. Totalitära, då syftar jag på partier som är antidemokratiska. Där har vi kommunister, där har vi fascister. Det är partier som inte bara vill ändra på lite spelregler, som vill ha ett helt annat system, som är odemokratiska. De hade en gång i tiden på 80-talet ungefär 7% av väljarna i Europa bakom sig. 6% till vänster, 1% till höger. Stödet är nu rekordlågt. Vi är nere nu i att färre än 2 av 100 väljare i Europa önskar sig ett antidemokratiskt alternativ eller röstar på ett parti som förespråkar det. Utan det är just den här populismen som har ökat. Den är inte antidemokratisk, men den har som jag sa, en mer auktoritär demokrati. Så det är det som går uppåt. Det är väldigt viktigt att förstå, tror jag. Det finns många tolkningar som utgår från att det är samma sorts utmaning över tid här. Men det vi ser är inte fascismens återkomst, det vi ser är populismens uppgång. Det är någonting nytt, det är inte det gamla som kommer tillbaka. Det här är också en ganska dramatisk kurva där man tittar, det är väldigt enkelt, alltså varje år i Europa från 1980 och framåt, vid varje år hur många länder har haft ett sånt här parti i regeringsställning. Några gånger har det varit nere på 0, senast 1990. Annars så, även på 80-talet fanns det vid enstaka tillfällen. Vi hade de finska kommunisterna, satt i regering i Finland, kommunistpartiet i Frankrike var koalitionsregering med socialistpartiet några gånger. Det sker en ökning under 90-talet. Det här vid tillfällen, exempelvis när det blir stora rubriker när FPÖ i Österrike bildar koalitionsregering med de konservativa. Men som ni ser, där vi befinner oss nu har vi aldrig varit förut. 9 länder i Europa har partier som uppfyller de här kriterierna i regeringsställning. Därtill åtminstone ytterligare 2 länder där de här partierna spelar en aktiv roll som stödparti i parlament. Och vi är uppe i 11 av 33, det var 3:e europeisk regering som innehåller eller är helt beroende av ett parti av de här kriterierna. Så det här är inte bara en abstraktion, det här typen av väljarstöd. Det är också någonting som får konkret effekt. Sista bilden som vi kommer komma in på tror jag, mer i diskussionerna, men bara för att slänga ur det. Min bedömning är att de beprövade strategierna har misslyckats. Man har försökt att isolera de här partierna, det har inte hjälpt. Man har försökt att konkurrera, det vill säga ta deras sakfrågor eller ta deras ståndpunkter. Det har inte hjälpt. Vi ska sluta se, tror jag, populismens framväxt som ett symptom på någonting annat. Vi ska inte se det som en tillfälligt hot, utan det här är någonting permanent. Om man räknar på samma sätt som jag gör och tittar på liberala partier, partier med liberalismen som primär ideologi, brett räknat, inklusive svenska moderater och centerpartister och till och med liberalerna, så hamnar vi i 8% av Europas väljare. Det är hälften så mycket som bara högerpopulisterna får. Det är de storleksordningen vi har nu. De är här för att stanna och därför bör de också hanteras på sätt. Ska vi spara det till diskussion eller vill du att jag säger det nu?
Eller du kan dra det fort.
Och då har jag 4 punkter vi lyfter fram i rapporten. För det första, när man förhandlar, för det kommer man behöva göra, skilj mellan sakfrågor och frågor som berör den liberala demokratins fundament. Det är en sak att kompromissa om energipolitik eller betyg i skolan. Det är en helt annan sak att ge efter när det gäller grundläggande demokratiska principer. Den uppdelningen måste man klara av att göra när man möter den här typen av partier. Det klarade socialdemokratin under många decennier med kommunisterna. Men det var aldrig aktuellt att förhandla om säkerhetspolitik. Men däremot så kunde man naturligtvis ge efter i en skattefråga eller en bidragsfråga. Se över behovet av farthinder. Det som händer, som vi kommer få höra strax om också tror jag, är ju att när de här partierna kommer till makten så vill de göra det enklare att snabbt få inom sin agenda. Demokratin behöver farthinder. 2/3 hinder för vissa typer av beslut och liknande. Olika procedurer, man kan behöva stärka författningsdomstolars roll och liknande. Det finns olika sätt i olika länder, olika behov, olika stora, men det är ett perspektiv man bör ha med. Behandla partier likvärdigt. Sluta tro att man kan isolera eller stänga ut enskilda partier den vägen. Och det sista, populismen vinner näring av brustna löften. Tron att politiken kan fixa allting. Då kommer, när man inte kan leverera det, så kommer det komma andra partier som säger att men det är för att de är korrupta eller de inte vill väl. Vi kan fixa det här åt er. Det är därför förenar både vänster- och högerpopulister, att man lovar det som de andra har misslyckats med. Och här måste man, tror jag, pedagogiskt uppriktigt förklara att det är inte politiken möjlig att göra. Där stannar jag introduktionen.
Tack så mycket. And now I would like Diego and Matej to come up. Because this is the part where we start discussing the different experiences that we have in Europe. And I think I would like Matej to first give a broad overview of the situation in Hungary.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in this beautiful city. Unfortunately, it's not a pleasure for me to represent a country which has the highest number of populists in government. But let me tell you how this came to be in Hungary, which when we had the democratic changes in the late 80s, early 90s, we were the most hopeful country in the among the most post-communist countries. But in 2014, our Prime Minister Viktor Orbán openly declared in a speech that he is willing and he is indeed working to end liberal democracy in Hungary, and he is going to implement a system based on Russia. And indeed, our Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is a close friend with Vladimir Putin, whose less than democratic policies are very apparent in Russia. Our government right now, a very populist government, has been working very hard to model some of Russia's very frightful policies, for example, harassing the NGOs, trying to weaken the system of checks and balances, and weakening the freedom of the press. And this is all because all they want is power. Hungary right now is the land of paradoxes and the land of no consequences. And this came to be in 2010 when the current government, Fidesz, won in a landslide elections, and they managed to gain a supermajority, two-third majority in Hungary, which enabled them to do whatever they want, and they wanted a lot. First, they implemented a completely new constitution, which gave them a lot of power. They usually change the election laws before every single major election, so the laws are tailor-made to their own benefits. They came to be in power saying that they are a conservative party because the previous government was a socialist party and they were very unpopular. So the opposite of that, of course, is a conservative party in Hungary, despite the fact that this party, Fidesz, started off as a classical liberal party, a very minimal government and capitalistic party in the early 90s. Then they became, or according to them, they became a conservative party. However, as I mentioned, Hungary is a land of paradoxes. So despite of them proclaiming that they are a conservative party, their economic policies are more socialist than the Socialist Party proposes to do. For example, they are nationalizing a lot of things. They are buying up financial institutions. They have nationalized the private pension funds, and they are centralizing education. And it's a huge problem in Hungary that education is in the hands of the government. There's huge protests against that. A lot of the teachers are uniting and demonstrating against the centralization that's going on in Hungary. But as I mentioned, Hungary is a land of no consequences. Our prime minister branded all of the teachers en masse collectively as left-wingers because they oppose the government. The government in Hungary plays to fearmonger. They are always finding an enemy they can protect the people from, or an enemy they can fight against. The governing party, Fidesz, came to fame in the early 90s as a freedom-fighting party against the then communist regime, and they never stopped their freedom fight. They must find someone to fight against, and currently they are fighting against the European Union, but Hungary being, again, the land of paradoxes, we are one of the most, we receive one of the biggest funds from Brussels. But after the governing party comes home from Brussels, after they begged for a lot of money in Hungary, they are very much against the European Union. Our speaker for the parliament took down the European flag from the building of the parliament, for example. It's in the benefit of the governing party to find an enemy, and sometimes the enemy is the European Union, sometimes the enemy is the communist, sometimes the enemy is in fact the United States or the rich people from the United States who, according to the governing party, wants to meddle into Hungary's affairs. For example, the famous philanthropist and investor George Soros, himself of Hungarian descent, and he was born in fact in Budapest, he was branded as someone who tries to fund the opposition, which all very paradoxical and ironic because the high echelons of the Hungarian governing party Fidesz have been studying abroad on George Soros scholarships. So, but they've needed to find a new enemy. You know, the United States is meddling into a lot of countries. They are rich, so why not the United States? And now we have the refugee crisis, and it was a perfect opportunity for the governing party to move their populist propaganda against the immigrants. So they are claiming that the Muslim hordes are trying to conquer Europe once again, and they want to abolish Christianity, and they are going to rape and pillage and so on and so forth. The fact is there are barely any refugees in Hungary. They just want to pass through to a better and more liberal land, of course, because they are running away from a land of radicalism, a land of terror, and they are fed up with any illiberal government. So they would like to go to the West. They are passing through Hungary, but Hungary being an entrance country, there are a lot of people passing through Hungary. So it was in the favor of the government to showcase these people, to get them stuck in the middle of Hungary in Budapest so they can showcase them to the media. So lo and behold, there are a lot of immigrants and they are attacking Hungary. So as I mentioned, the whole point of populism in Hungary is to create fear. And the government promises that they are going to save the people and protect the people from this set of enemy. And it doesn't matter anymore what they say. It doesn't matter anymore that they are illiberal, because there are worse cases. For example, now in the communication propaganda for the immigrants or the EU itself. So people shouldn't care that Fidesz is not the most liberal, in fact, it's a very illiberal party, but they are saying that if they are not in government, then their worst enemy will come. And that's a problem, unfortunately, because the fear factor is so high that there are no alternative parties right now to Fidesz. All of the parties before have been entangled in corruption cases, and still Fidesz is the most popular party. The other alternative is a neo-Nazi party, a far-right party, which is centralizing right now. They are an alternative that's never been in government, but until the point if Hungarians manage to initiate a new political force, which is not based on left and right, which has absolutely lost meaning in Hungary. As I mentioned, the self-proclaimed conservatives are very socialist in their economic policies. Up until the point we can find a new political force, Hungarians manage to set up a new political force that talks sense, then Fidesz is still going to win with their populist propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. One question before we move over to the Spanish example. When we talked earlier, you said that you were not very hopeful about the parties that remain, or the established parties. Would you think that there would be any way for the established parties to come back and rejuvenate and actually be a proper opposition, or do you need a clean slate?
No, unfortunately, the parties, the opposition parties, there are left-wing parties, and they are fledglings of the Socialist Party. So they are set off by people who were either leaders of the Socialist Party or prime ministers from the Socialist Party, and they are very unpopular. There are very, very small parties, and they cannot really find any common ground with any other left-wing parties. So they are not managing to find common grounds. They aren't able to form a coalition because of that, and people distrust them. And in many cases, it's in their benefit to be in opposition, because they don't have to deliver. If they are in high positions, they would have to deliver some policy. They would have to find solutions to the problems that exist in Hungary, which right now they don't really have any solutions. And the other alternative party, the other opposition party, which is now the second most popular party in Hungary, is Jobbik, which is a party with neo-Nazi background. It's a far-right party, and for any moderate people, that should not be an alternative. But the thing is that things are so bad in Hungary that 40% of the voters wouldn't choose any of the parties. They are looking for an alternative, and many found this alternative in this far-right party, and they disregard the fact that it's a radical party, because a lot of their voters are not radical themselves. But this is a party that's a fresh party that's not been in politics, not been in corruption scandals. But right now, I don't think that this far-right party would be able to be in government. I can easily see a scenario where our populist party Fidesz and this far-right party Jobbik will form a coalition in the next elections in 2018. But I don't trust that the left-wing opposition will manage to rebound from their loss of success in 2010. So we need a new party that's not formed alongside the lines of left-wing or right-wing. It's formed alongside of policies, and people should disregard the fact that they call them right-wing or left-wing, because in pragmatic sense, these terms have lost their meaning. So we need policies and not dividing lines. So we shouldn't say dividing things like left-wing or right-wing. We should say that this party is against corruption, against the illiberal tendencies in Hungary, and we should say what these people are for rather than what they are against.
Okay, thank you. So, Diego, take us to Spain.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here at Timbro. Anytime a politician has trouble explaining what his vision is for Spain, he turns to Sweden, and he says we should be like social democrats in Sweden. The thing is, when they talk about Sweden, they're not talking about today's Sweden, which has reformed some of its troubles from the past, but they're talking about 1970s Sweden. So of course, being here just 1 week before our general election has a special meaning for me. As we were discussing, as Andreas was showing, it's sort of populism is a left-wing, a far-left phenomenon in the southern European countries, and you see it not only in my country, in Spain, but you also see that in Greece, obviously, with everything that's happening there. In Portugal, where the electoral results actually overthrew the Conservative Party, and the legislative agreement right now, the one that conditions the actions of government, has populist parties in place. And the same with Italy, perhaps the harder to really explain, because it has a very not very easy to understand strategy, and of course the case with Spain, which is a full-on far left populism. In the case of Spain, as you see here, there does seem to be a correlation between the share of votes and the problem of unemployment. As you know, we've had big unemployment crisis through the years because we've never liberalized our labor market. We did it 2 years ago, and oh surprise, we've created 1 million new jobs, but perhaps it's too late now and a lot of people are angry. Also, the rise of the far left in Spain has been a phenomenon that has been ongoing within the ranks of the left. So there was always going to be a market for a more authoritarian side on things, but they just needed the sexy appeal of a populist leader like Pablo Iglesias, who can brand that far left approach as something that is not about old school communism, but maybe about going and overthrowing these elites and bringing a fresher democracy to Spain. Young Spaniards are loving this, and on average, the support for Podemos, which is our big populist party, is moving between 40 and 50% for everyone younger than 35 years old. The support for the other parties, and we have the typical conservative and the Social Democratic Party, plus there's a new center party that has come up. And all these parties, their ceiling is 20%. For all of them, and they all move between 10 and 20%, as opposed to around 50% for all Spaniards with less than 35 years old. And these guys, this new party, is engaging in a never-ending campaign. So the way to not put forward what you really want to do in Spain, the way to hide your message, the way to support your agenda without actually revealing the authoritarian nature of most of your policies, is to engage in a never-ending campaign. So what you see here is the Google popularity of searches in Spain. And these guys are able to set the agenda first, talking about the problems with the young people. It was the 15M movement. You probably remember that a lot of young Spaniards went on the streets and did massive protests some 5 years ago. That started it. Then they moved on to talk about home evictions, which is always something that you can show very powerful when you've had a housing crisis and people are losing their homes. So they sort of took that flag as well. And then when that's starting to die out with the economic recovery, they moved on to corruption, which is now their main message. What's next? Well, whenever this graphic starts to go down, they will find the next. Don't worry about it. Also, it's harder to tackle populism when there is a connection with the Venezuelan regime that has been proven by official documents. There's been like 8 million euros of Venezuelan money flowing into the foundation of the leaders of the party. So, of course, when you start your party with 8 million euros, well, I guess it's easier than when you start with no money at all. And we've also, picking up on the work by Timbro, we've created a subnational index on populism, and we've identified that besides the national authoritarian brand of populism, there are some secessionist parties in the periphery of Spain that have moved away from the traditionally conservative background of the secessionists in the Basque Country or in Catalonia, and then they have embraced some of this more populist and more leftist and radical agenda. And there's also one outlier that I'm not going to bother talking about him, but he's like basically a clown in one of our regions. And we brand that as charismatic populism because there's no way to know what he really thinks. And the funny thing is that as you see, from ranking 11 to ranking 17, all of these have basically no scores in the categories that we dedicated to the other sorts of populism. What does this mean? What this means is that authoritarian populism is not really growing as much in these regions where there is no separatist or secessionist feelings. But where there are, which is basically rankings 1 to 10, they create this connection and they can come into coalition for the election, and the secessionist message correlates with the populist message because both are anti-establishment to a certain degree. Some are going after the state of Spain as an idea, and the others are going against the state of Spain as a policy framework. And in both cases, we see that the support for populism is going up way higher. And for example, you see total votes of between 12 and 22% in the places where there is no disconnection. And in the places where they do have disagreement, it goes from 27 to 47%, even in the case of Navarra and the Basque Country. So as you can see here in the periphery, the support is higher. And finally, where has this led us? It has led us to significant political fragmentation. As you know, we haven't had a government for 6 months, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a bad thing if you have a populist party threatening to come to power. So instead of enjoying a good time with not over-regulation and taxes and all the problems that excessive government may bring, it's been more or less a period of uncertainty because there's a big elephant in the room called populism. And the result is, like I said, that the political vote has really fragmented, and I just thought I'd close with some remarks on how to deal with it. And in my opinion, I think what you should never give populists is the monopoly of any sort of message or idea. When you create a new product on your own in the market, your company suddenly enters a winner-takes-all market, and all the profits go for you, and yes, the competition will catch up. Samsung eventually, or Ericsson eventually, will catch up with Apple, and yes, there will come a day where that might happen, but for 10, 15 years, Apple has been the monopoly, basically, on the category that they created with the smartphone. Well, I think that this is similar. If you let the populists be the ones that talk about corruption, about immigration, about market reforms, about welfare state, about anything, if you give them a monopoly of ideas, they will run away with that monopoly and they will profit on that as long as the other parties do not engage. So instead of, I don't know about political isolation, because I do believe that you need to try and close the institutions. I don't think you should really allow them to come into power, but that's a complex strategy. But I do think that I'm very worried about the isolation in terms of the battle of ideas, which is what we do in think tanks and what the media does and what civil society must do, is to engage with them. And if they want to talk about immigration, for example, in Sweden, fine, let's talk about immigration, but let's do it the right way and promote smart reforms. Let's not promote populist agendas. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we go into the more general discussion, I'd just like to backtrack a little bit on the Venezuela trend. Because I know that quite a few of the people that founded Podemos has actually been advisors, is that correct?
Yes.
Advised to Venezuela and Bolivia?
High-ranking officials in Venezuela.
Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, I think it's an interesting connection, because basically it's leaving them without nothing to talk about. Like, they basically used to talk about Venezuela as something, as an example that we should follow. Now they don't seem too keen to talk about it, and they don't understand why the people want to talk about Venezuela when they were the ones that brought Venezuela to the Spanish debate. The same thing is happening in terms of Greece. They used to talk about Greece. They used to send messages to Alexis Tsipras saying, Alexis, just wait for us, we're coming to help you. And suddenly there's no references to Greece in their speech, and they also get upset and they say, wait, why are you bringing Greece up in the debate? So what they've done something really genius, and their latest manifesto monitors a catalog for IKEA because they want to portray themselves as, like I said, Swedish social democrats. So elaborating on the Chavista connection, these folks were like political science professors at the most radically left university in Spain. And basically, when you're trying to create a good a new evolution of communism, which is the case with Bolivarian regimes in Latin America, the place to go if you want to find real radical professors in political sciences who speak Spanish is this university they went to. So they started working with them as advisories, and it's been documented that there was payments to the amount of 8 million euros that were driven to them. They also have some ties to Iran. which has funded their TV programming through the years. They had a small TV station. And just to show you the amount of money we're talking about in these relationships and these ties they have, I'll just tell you that a political science professor who's never put a single number in his reports, like a full-on Marxist theory guy, he got paid almost €500,000 to suddenly draft a report about monetary integration in Latin America. So that's the sort of money we're talking about, and that's the sort of connection we're talking about.
Thank you, Diego. Andreas, would you like to comment on any of the comments?
I think that these two examples are representative in a broader way of what's happening in more countries. One aspect here is, of course, the ability of the populist parties to find strange friends outside of Europe, or eastern parts of Europe in the case of Fidesz. I mean, the ties to the Putin regime is not exclusively a Fidesz phenomenon, but for most of the right-wing populist parties, and the ties to the Venezuelan and Latin American authoritarian regimes are typical of many of the left-wing populists. And also, if we turn to Sweden, these are the two examples that Sverigedemokraterna and Vänsterpartiet likes to talk about. Fidesz Hungary is the dream for many Sweden Democrats. I would make a quote in Swedish, if you excuse me, of Erik Almqvist, who as you do migrated to Hungary a few years ago, and he said that den frihetliga socialkonservatism och nationalismen norm i Ungern och den svenska fåran av genus och mångkulturalism får man leta efter sympati för. Som ett exempel, as an example of how Fidesz and the policy there is the sort of idea of what could be created in Sweden as well. And the leader of the Swedish Left Party described the Podemos party, together with the Syriza party, as I quote, friska fläktar som faktiskt på riktigt vill folkets väl. And so that's the combined dream. I think often the radical left in Sweden and other countries always have a tendency to find something distant that we could import. It used to be the Soviet Union in the 1930s, or China in the 1960s, or Latin America. Now it's Southern Europe for the Swedish radical left, while the radical right in Sweden most often goes backwards in time and dream of the old days before they were born themselves, but when it was a homogeneous country, and now they have found some sort of inspiration also in Hungary.
Briefly, Andreas, Mattei said that maybe we shouldn't focus so much on the left and the right, but it seems to me that most of these populist movements also in Spain and Hungary are rather post-political in their outlook. It's not really about policies, it's more about being anti-establishment. How do you cope with that? I mean, how do you attack an opponent who is not actually propagating anything, but is just rather being vaguely against something?
Yes, and that is, I think, part of what's really problematic here, because one of the answers to populism, which I myself also have given, is that, well, we should focus on the left-right dimension. If the right actually advocates liberal policy, and if the Social Democrats advocates and talk about left solutions to problems, we will have that old-fashioned left-right conflict, which is good, because then there's conflict in politics, and that means it's less space for the populists. But as you say, many of them are post-political in the term that they're not so interested in the traditional left or the right solutions. So I don't think that is a universal solution to it. I don't see any other way around. We can't all be post-political since we believe in things, but that's really an issue here.
Diego, there has been some theories that I know Kasmud, I have no idea how this is pronounced, but anyway, he's a famous scientist who's been doing a lot of research on this topic of populism, and he said that left-wing populism is probably going to die because they grew out of resentment, out of austerity measures, and now austerity and economical issues are not really on the agenda. Now it's socio-cultural issues rather. Do you think he's right?
No, I don't think he's right. I think he needs to come to Spain for a vacation, and he'll see that Spain has implemented some free market reforms that have been successful. In the last few years, we've liberalized business hours, we've liberalized the labor market, we've cut taxes in the last year as well. And we are leading growth in the Eurozone. We had higher than 3% growth last year. And unemployment has come down by around 1 million people. I will probably write about it in English so that people can find out that we actually do something right sometimes. But the thing is, while this recovery is ongoing, support for populism keeps growing at the same time. So I don't see the connection. And even if you recall from my presentation, the support for the far left had been growing before the economic crisis. Or even, like, some people want to put this on the Eurozone, which obviously creates some political tensions, and there was the idea that Milton Friedman once said that creating a monetary union could lead to higher political trouble, and that's true, it could. I mean, we have seen a lot of tensions between countries, but at the same time, I think that holds for the left-wing populism, which has grown as a result of the crisis, but not for the right-wing populism, because Andreas' work shows like 3 decades of continuous growth. So not everything can be explained by austerity. I guess maybe with the left-wing populism, part of it is, but like I'm telling you, like, the recovery has not slowed them down. And with the right-wing populism, we need to find some other proxies for, because it's been growing for 30 years with good and bad economic times.
Mm. But I mean, we discussed earlier that Hungary is really an exception, that usually populist parties do not fare very well, at least in the beginning when they assume power, but Fidesz is still the most popular of all the parties. To what extent do you think that is because they have rather sophisticated mobilization techniques, that they actually do quite a lot of work in between of elections, in the sense that sort of established parties maybe don't?
It was certainly true when they first came to power. In their recent government in 2010, it's not anymore, so they are not engaged in any campaign strategies that much. So they are not debating with the opposition. They didn't really have a program before last elections. What they do is have mass rallies, and they have very populist speeches, again, calling someone as an enemy. That's the usual strategy. But they are not as good with mobilizing. They have lost touch with their voters, so they don't really care anymore what their voters respond to on policies. They know very well what resonates well with the voters on fear factors, but they don't mobilize, they don't engage in debates anymore. They definitely don't do any door-to-door campaignings, which unfortunately none of the parties do in Hungary, but I think that would be very important. So I really believe that the whole point of Fidesz popularity is in wholly populist agendas. It has nothing to do with very good campaign strategies. It has to do with finding certain points, and they are pushing those points very, very harshly, and they are always trying to find someone as an enemy. But for example, with other parties, it's certainly they are trying to mimic the way that Fidesz managed to do small circles of like-minded people, and that's how Fidesz first managed to gain a lot of popularity and attention. But nowadays it's not so much, and Fidesz has lost a lot of popularity, but they are still the most popular party, and that's because the other thing I mentioned, that there's no real alternative, and there's no alternative that is a hopeful alternative. So people would vote for a party that they think could be able to beat Fidesz, but there's no such party. So people are afraid to cast a losing ballot, so they are not going to vote for someone they know that's going to lose.
Andreas, it seems that the mobilization point is common with most of the populist factors, that they are actually very good at getting people to be very committed. But again, it's easier to get people to be very committed against something than it is to make them become very committed for something. How do you deal with that? That is my first question. Another one is, if you look into the Sweden Democrats, for instance, I think you also have a lot of examples of them they have their own media outlets, they're building up their own separate world. You can see that on the internet. They are much more active than people that are belonging to the established parties. Is there any way for sort of old democracy to revive in a way that could ever make them as interesting an example or case, especially for young people?
Maybe. I think you are completely right, and that's an underestimated aspect of it, that many hold the view that these are one-man shows. At least they held the view for a long time, that the populist parties are one-man shows. They are built from the top down. They are quite fragile constructions that will, fall down once it becomes a leadership crisis or something happens. And there are quite a few such cases, but most of them are not. Most of these parties are right the opposite. They are grassroots movements. They're built from the bottom up. And as you say, they also not only they are strong in mobilizing people in different ages, differing in the cities and in the outside of the cities and in the countryside. And they say that they build up their own sort of media institutions and so on. It's a parallel political universe that are moving into the European democracies, and it won't go away. And as I can't see how we can isolate them. So we need to find some sort of common ground in terms of finding that arena where we can still have politics as usual, with them as just a disturbing, annoying thing that is there, but we still have to deal with.
So last question for all of you, which will be the same, and that's basically, are there any natural limits to populism? To what extent can you survive just being outside of the system and change things? And what do you think would be the right sort of national strategies to use in your home countries? Matti?
As to the first part of the question, I don't think that there exists any limit within the system. I mean, in Hungary, we are lucky from that perspective that we have the European Union, which many deem as an overstretching and not a very functional institution. But from a Hungarian perspective, the European Union is there as a sort of checks and balance, a system which we starting to lack in Hungary. So there are certain safeguards that can exist. We can, of course, debate how potent they are and what can the European Union do, which is not a lot, unfortunately. But I'm very optimistic, despite of all the harsh things I'm experiencing in Hungary, that people are not stupid. So populism can work. People can be people can be scared, but ultimately, voters are not stupid, and politicians and parties shouldn't treat people as sheeple, as stupid people. In Hungary, as I mentioned, 40% of the voters don't really know who they are going to vote for. So I think in the best way of dealing with populists is finding people who are not in any way associated with any previous parties, as that's Hungarian best practice, finding independent candidates. The previous director of the think tank I'm representing has been running at an election in a very hostile place, in a place which was a bastion for Fidesz, and at a by-election he went door to door, started engaging with the people, and he won the election by a huge margin, and he was the one who broke the supermajority of Fidesz. And we need more people like him, simply. We need more enthusiastic, fresh people who have not been corrupted by previous political parties before. And I think that's a good practice for other parties or other countries as well, that we should not be engaging the context that the populists created, that there are, for example, certain factors we should be afraid of, that we should not be engaging in the debate of austerity measures or of recessions or of the refugee crisis, because these are the points that the populists are winning on, and they are dragging the other parties, the opposition parties, into this dialogue. And the opposition parties should learn how to steer clear of these points and say that, no, there's nothing to be afraid of, or this works perfectly well, or whatever, but don't be dragged into these made-up contexts.
Diego?
I would hope there is a natural end to it, but what I'm afraid is that it gets to a point where most of these radical messages that come with populism will be embedded into the political system. So it will become, just like we created a European consensus, that is rather sort of like a negotiation, if you will, between conservatives, social democrats, liberals, etc. If that consensus shifts to more radical positions, then you don't even need to embrace the whole populist agenda. You can be in the system, like we see in Hungary, and you have used the populist strategy to move everyone else to your consensus, to the authoritarian consensus. Hence the importance of not only focusing on populism, but on authoritarian populism, like we are. And also, in terms of what do we do, The thing is, like, we're in the think tank world for something. We believe in ideas, and ideas have consequences, and the good ideas have good consequences, and the bad ideas have bad consequences. And as long as we let these folks be the only ones that are talking about whatever it is they're talking, depends on the country. Here it's immigration. In my country, it's apparently now corruption. But there's always going to be some other things that come up. As long as we give them that monopoly of ideas, and as long as we leave that field completely open for them to conquer, it will be a winner-takes-all market. They will take all the support they can get, and we will be years behind. And here we are. We're trying to struggle, and if we had maybe been smarter, we could have seen this coming, and maybe we could have this index like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but at least we're doing it now. So where do we go next? Well, I think it's now that we have mapped the progress of populism, we focus on the ideas and we promote smart, liberal reforms that address these issues that they're trying to bring up and lead to changes that benefit society as a whole, instead of strengthening authoritarian movements.
Andreas, why didn't you do this 5 years ago? Last word.
Thank you. I agree, and I think my final point should be that despite of this index and what we're doing here, the focus should not be on the parties. The focus should be on the ideas, just as Diego says. I also write that in the report, that the authoritarian ideas are a worse problem than the growing support for populist parties. And I mean, if we compare how it used to be 20 years ago, there was quite sharp lines dividing the established parties from what was then the anti-establishment parties. Both the left and the right in Europe was quite easy to distinguish between a decent conservative or social democratic party and the autocratic or totalitarian ideas that were outside. And there are no sharp dividing lines anymore, because the authoritarian ideas have already moved into the mainstream to some extent. While at the same time, the anti-establishment parties are also becoming partly part of that consensus to some extent. They are also changing. So it is quite difficult to distinguish the good from the bad in terms of political parties. I still have my ID, of course, but it's more difficult today than 20 years ago. So the focus should be on the ideas, the authoritarian ideas. How do we stop them? How do we promote a liberal agenda in terms of no matter who's in government, but okay.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we will have to end here because now it's 1 o'clock, but thank you so much for coming, and a big hand to a great panel.